Giordano Bruno did not lead an army. He did not burn cities. He did not try to seize power. He did not call for rebellion. He did not write manifestos demanding revolution. He did something far quieter and far more dangerous. He asked questions. Questions that did not attack kings directly, but weakened the foundations beneath them. Questions that did not deny God outright, but refused to place limits on what God could be. Questions that refused to accept that the world had already been fully explained. In a time when certainty was power and doubt was treason, Bruno chose uncertainty. He spoke of an infinite universe, of countless worlds, of a reality far larger than any institution could control. And for this, he was not debated, he was not corrected, he was not persuaded. He was imprisoned for years, interrogated, pressured to recant, and finally led to a public square where he was burned alive. Not because he was proven wrong, but because he would not stop thinking. This is not a story about science versus religion or progress versus ignorance. This is a story about why systems fear questions more than weapons, why truth becomes a crime when it cannot be controlled, and why asking "what if" has so often been punished as if it were an act of violence. The world has never been afraid of violence in the way it has feared questions. Violence is loud, visible, and temporary. It announces itself openly, and because of that, it can be confronted, punished, justified, or absorbed into existing narratives. Questions are different. They do not arrive with noise or force. They enter quietly, almost politely, and settle inside the mind. Once there, they refuse to disappear. A question does not demand obedience. It demands thought, and thought is unpredictable. Every stable system, whether religious, political, cultural, or ideological, depends on the belief that the most important questions have already been answered. Religion offers final truths, states offer final laws, traditions offer final customs, and systems promise certainty in exchange for loyalty. A system does not survive by eliminating doubt entirely, but by controlling it, by deciding which questions are acceptable and which are forbidden. Acceptable questions improve efficiency without challenging authority. Dangerous questions ask whether the authority itself is legitimate. History shows that societies tolerate cruelty far more easily than uncertainty. Wars can be justified, executions ritualized, suffering normalized, as long as order is preserved. But a question that exposes contradiction weakens the psychological foundation of obedience. It creates hesitation, and hesitation is dangerous because it interrupts automatic compliance. A person who hesitates may stop obeying. A person who stops obeying threatens not only power, but the emotional security of those who rely on the system to make sense of the world. This is why truly dangerous questions are rarely answered directly. Instead, they are redirected, postponed, ridiculed, or punished. When a question reaches the foundation of belief, the response is almost never rational. It is emotional. Anger replaces dialogue. Fear replaces explanation. The questioner is labeled immoral, irresponsible, naive, corrupt, or dangerous, not because the question is wrong, but because it destabilizes meaning. Most systems do not silence questions immediately. They begin by exhausting the person who asks them. They surround the question with mockery and social pressure. They suggest it is inappropriate, unrealistic, or badly timed. Now is not the moment, they say. You don't understand how things work. Over time, asking becomes costly. It costs status, relationships, safety, belonging. Eventually, silence feels wiser than curiosity. What makes questions truly frightening is that they are contagious. One question rarely stands alone. It invites another, and then another. If one belief collapses, others begin to tremble. This is why systems do not fear ignorance as much as they fear independent thinking. Ignorance can be guided, thinking cannot. A person who asks questions may still obey today, but tomorrow they may hesitate, and the day after that, they may refuse. And once refusal becomes imaginable, control begins to weaken. Who was Giordano Bruno? Giordano Bruno was not born a rebel, and he did not grow up intending to challenge the foundations of his world. He was born in 1548 in Nola, a small town near Naples, into a deeply religious and hierarchical society where faith was not a private matter, but the organizing principle of life itself. From an early age, Bruno showed an unusual intellectual intensity. He was drawn not only to religious texts, but to memory, symbols, philosophy, and the hidden structures behind ideas. This curiosity did not place him outside the system. On the contrary, it brought him directly into its center. He joined the Dominican order, one of the most disciplined and intellectually rigorous branches of the church. He became a monk, studied theology, logic, Aristotle, Plato, and church doctrine, and lived inside the very institution that would later condemn him. This is essential to understand. Bruno was not an outsider attacking religion from the margins. He was formed by it. He knew its language, its texts, its rituals, and its internal logic. His conflict did not come from ignorance, but from understanding too much and refusing to stop there. As he studied, Bruno began to notice cracks, not in faith itself, but in the certainty with which authority claimed to define reality. He was fascinated by ancient philosophy, especially Plato, Neoplatonism, Hermetic texts, and ideas that suggested the universe was alive, dynamic, and far larger than any single doctrine allowed. For Bruno, God was not a distant ruler sitting above a fixed cosmos. God was infinite, and an infinite God implied an infinite universe. This idea alone quietly undermined the entire medieval worldview, which placed Earth and humanity at the center of creation, surrounded by neatly ordered celestial spheres. Bruno's thinking expanded beyond theology into cosmology, metaphysics, and psychology. He believed that truth was not something handed down fully formed, but something approached through exploration, imagination, and continuous questioning. This made him deeply uncomfortable to those around him, not because he rejected God, but because he refused to limit God to human systems. His early conflicts with church authorities were subtle at first. He questioned interpretations, removed images of saints from his cell, and read forbidden books. These were warning signs, not crimes, but they revealed a pattern. Bruno could not pretend certainty where he felt doubt. He could not repeat formulas that no longer made sense to him. Eventually, suspicion followed him. He left the monastery, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of survival. What followed was a life of constant movement. Bruno traveled across Europe, living in France, England, Germany, and other regions, teaching, debating, writing, and always questioning. He was brilliant, charismatic, and often abrasive. He did not soften his ideas to make them acceptable. He believed that truth did not need permission. This made him admired by some and despised by many. Unlike scientists who focused narrowly on observation, Bruno spoke in sweeping philosophical visions. He connected cosmology to freedom, infinity to dignity, and thought to moral responsibility. He was not merely saying that the universe was larger than previously believed. He was saying that human authority was smaller, that knowledge could not be owned, that meaning could not be sealed, that thought itself was sacred. This combination made him dangerous, not because he held power, but because he removed its illusion. Bruno was a man shaped by the system, educated by it, protected by it for a time, and then rejected by it when he crossed an invisible boundary. He did not cross it suddenly. He crossed it by continuing to think when he was expected to stop. And in a world built on fixed answers, that made him unforgivable. The most dangerous idea, the infinite cosmos. Giordano Bruno did not terrify his world because he proposed a new astronomical model. Heliocentrism alone was not enough to warrant death. What made Bruno truly dangerous was that he refused to place limits on the universe itself. He did not say that the Earth revolved around the sun and stop there. He said that the sun was not special either. He said that the universe had no center, no edge, and no final boundary. The stars in the night sky were not decorations fixed into a celestial shell, but distant suns, each surrounded by their own worlds. This idea shattered the closed, orderly cosmos that medieval Europe depended on psychologically. The traditional worldview was finite, hierarchical, and comforting. Everything had a place. God at the top, angels below, humans beneath them, animals below humans, and the earth resting calmly at the center of creation. Meaning flowed downward in a clear chain. Bruno's infinite cosmos dissolved this structure entirely. In an infinite universe, there is no privileged center. No single world is chosen above all others. No authority can claim cosmic validation simply by existing. Infinity is not just a scientific idea, it is a philosophical threat. A finite universe can be mapped, controlled, and symbolically owned. An infinite one cannot. Once the cosmos has no edges, human certainty begins to leak away. If there are countless worlds, then humanity is no longer the sole focus of creation. If the stars are suns, then the heavens are not a perfect realm separate from change and decay. If there is no cosmic center, then the idea of absolute earthly centers becomes fragile as well. Kings, churches, and doctrines lose their metaphysical backing. Bruno understood this implication clearly. He was not simply speculating about astronomy. He was attacking the psychological architecture of authority. An infinite cosmos implies an infinite freedom of thought. It suggests that reality cannot be fully captured by any single system of belief. For institutions built on final answers, this was catastrophic. The fear was not that Bruno might be wrong. The fear was that he might be right, because a right Bruno meant that certainty itself was an illusion. It meant that obedience was built not on divine order, but on habit and fear. In a closed universe, questioning feels like rebellion. In an infinite universe, questioning becomes natural. Bruno's cosmos did not replace one center with another. It removed the center altogether, and without a center, there is no place to anchor unquestioned authority. This is why the idea of infinity was treated as heresy, not because it contradicted Scripture line by line, but because it made Scripture interpretable rather than final. It transformed God from a ruler of a small, ordered stage into an endless presence beyond human classification. Such a God could not be monopolized. Such a universe could not be governed by fear, and such ideas could not be allowed to spread. Infinity did not just expand the sky. It collapsed the walls that kept power feeling eternal. Why did Galileo live and Bruno die? Giordano Bruno and Galileo Galilei are often placed side by side in history, as if they were punished for the same crime and simply received different sentences. But this comparison hides the deeper truth. They were not condemned for the same reason. They were not dangerous in the same way. And most importantly, they did not challenge power on the same level. Galileo lived because he negotiated with the system. Bruno died because he refused to recognize its authority over thought itself. Galileo was a scientist in the narrow sense. He focused on observation, measurement, and demonstration. He spoke about how the heavens moved, not what they meant. When confronted, he was willing to separate truth from identity. Under pressure, he recanted publicly. He accepted house arrest. He allowed the institution to preserve its appearance of control. Galileo's survival was not a victory of mercy. It was a transaction. The system allowed him to live because he confirmed its ultimate power to decide what could be said openly. Bruno, on the other hand, did not offer data that could be compartmentalized. He offered a worldview. He did not merely say that the earth was not the center of the cosmos. He said that nothing was. He did not merely challenge one doctrine. He challenged the idea that doctrine itself could ever be final. This made compromise impossible. You can silence a calculation. You cannot silence a philosophy without destroying the person who embodies it. Galileo could say, "I was mistaken," and continue thinking privately. Bruno could not. To recant would have meant denying the core of his identity. His ideas were not separate from who he was. They were how he understood existence itself. This distinction terrified authority. A scientist can be tolerated as long as science remains technical and obedient. A philosopher who connects cosmology to freedom, infinity to dignity, and thought to moral autonomy cannot be controlled so easily. Galileo's challenge threatened specific teachings. Bruno's challenge threatened the entire structure that decided which teachings were allowed. The Church did not fear telescopes. It feared the loss of epistemic monopoly. Galileo's work could be reframed as error. Bruno's thinking could not be safely reframed at all. It undermined the very mechanism of judgment. This is why Bruno was imprisoned for years and repeatedly pressured to recant. The goal was not correction, it was submission. When submission failed, punishment became symbolic. His execution was not about silencing him, it was about warning others. Galileo's survival taught the lesson that obedience preserves life. Bruno's death taught the lesson that independence of thought would not be tolerated. History often presents Galileo as a hero and Bruno as a martyr, but the deeper lesson is darker. Systems do not kill truth, they kill refusal. They do not destroy ideas, they destroy examples. Galileo showed that one could think and still bow. Bruno showed that one could think and refuse to kneel. One path was survivable, the other was unforgivable. Giordano Bruno and Galileo Galilei are often remembered as if they faced the same crime and simply received different punishments. But this comparison misses the core truth. They were not dangerous in the same way. Galileo challenged specific claims about the heavens, but he did not challenge the right of authority to define reality itself. He argued about how the universe moved, not about who had the power to decide meaning. When pressure came, Galileo separated his ideas from his survival. He recanted publicly, accepted house arrest, and allowed the system to preserve its image of control. His survival was not mercy, it was negotiation. The system tolerated him because he confirmed that it still held the final word. Bruno did the opposite. He did not offer a theory that could be corrected or revised. He offered a worldview that dissolved the very idea of final authority. He did not say the Church was wrong about one thing. He implied that no institution could ever fully own truth. For Bruno, to recant was not to admit error, but to deny his own understanding of existence. His ideas were not detachable arguments. They were his identity. This made compromise impossible. A system can absorb a scientist who retreats. It cannot absorb a thinker who refuses to kneel. Galileo showed that one could think privately and obey publicly. Bruno showed that thought itself did not belong to power. That example was intolerable. The danger was not that Bruno might convince everyone. The danger was that he demonstrated refusal was possible. Systems do not execute ideas, they execute symbols. Galileo lived because he preserved the hierarchy. Bruno died because he exposed it. The trial. Putting a question on trial. Giordano Bruno was not brought before the Inquisition to debate ideas. The purpose of his trial was never to discover truth. It was to measure obedience. Courts that judge thinkers do not ask whether an idea is correct. They ask whether it can be controlled. From the moment Bruno was arrested, the outcome was already shaped. He was not treated as a man who might be mistaken, but as a man who refused limits. His imprisonment lasted years, not because the case was complex, but because the system hoped exhaustion would succeed where argument failed. The trial was slow, repetitive, and psychological. Bruno was confronted with lists of propositions extracted from his writings, not to understand them, but to isolate and simplify them until they could be declared heretical. Context was removed, nuance was erased, ideas were reduced to slogans that could be condemned. This is how power judges thought. It does not engage complexity, it flattens it. Throughout the proceedings, the goal was not evidence but recantation. Again and again, Bruno was offered a way out. He could live if he would deny his ideas publicly. Silence would have been enough. Partial retreat would have been enough. But submission had to be visible. The institution did not need him to believe differently. It needed him to say so. Truth was irrelevant. Performance was everything. To recant would have meant more than correcting a mistake. It would have meant accepting that authority, not conscience, defined reality. Bruno understood this clearly. He did not argue loudly in court. He did not shout or provoke. He simply refused to surrender the independence of his mind. That refusal transformed the trial into something symbolic. The courtroom became a stage where power attempted to reassert its dominance over thought itself. What made the trial unbearable for the authorities was Bruno's consistency. Years passed, but his position did not collapse. He did not grow confused. He did not beg. He did not trade clarity for safety. This revealed the weakness of the system. A structure built on fear depends on eventual compliance. When compliance does not arrive, fear loses its effectiveness. At that point, punishment becomes necessary, not to correct the accused, but to reassure the obedient. Bruno's final sentence was not the conclusion of a legal process. It was a message. The message was simple. Questions that cannot be silenced by persuasion will be silenced by force. The trial did not end when the verdict was read. It ended when Bruno's body was destroyed in public, because the true audience of the trial was never Bruno. It was everyone else watching. What does it mean to be burned alive? Giordano Bruno was not executed simply to be killed. Burning at the stake was never chosen because it was efficient. It was chosen because it was visible, slow, and unforgettable. To burn a person alive is not only to end a life, but to communicate a message. It turns punishment into a spectacle and death into a warning. Fire does not erase quietly. It announces itself. It demands witnesses. It imprints fear into memory. When authorities choose fire, they are not addressing the condemned alone. They are speaking to the crowd, to future thinkers, to anyone who might consider following the same path. Burning alive is a punishment designed to collapse meaning. It strips the condemned of dignity in public, reducing a thinking human being to a body in pain. This transformation is intentional. It tells observers that ideas, no matter how complex or profound, will ultimately be reduced to flesh if they challenge power. The fire declares that thought has limits, and those limits are enforced by pain. In this sense, burning is not a reaction to danger. It is a performance of control. It shows that authority reaches beyond law and into the body itself. For Bruno, fire was chosen because silence had failed. Years of imprisonment, interrogation, and psychological pressure had not broken him. He had not retracted his ideas. He had not confessed error. The system had exhausted its softer tools. Fire was the final instrument, not to persuade him, but to erase the example he represented. A man who remains unbroken threatens the illusion that obedience is inevitable. Burning him was meant to restore that illusion. There is also a symbolic cruelty in fire. Fire consumes without discrimination. It does not argue, it does not judge, it simply destroys. By choosing fire, authority denies the humanity of the condemned. The person becomes an object, a problem to be eliminated. This mirrors how systems treat dangerous questions. They do not engage them deeply. They destroy them entirely. Public execution by burning also transfers responsibility away from individuals. No single person feels accountable. The crowd watches. Officials follow procedure. The executioner performs a task. Everyone participates, and therefore no one feels guilty. This diffusion of responsibility is essential. It allows cruelty to appear normal. It allows violence to feel justified. The ritual turns murder into duty, yet fire carries a paradox. While it is meant to erase, it often preserves. Flames draw attention. They fix memory. A quiet execution would have passed unnoticed. Fire ensures remembrance. Bruno's body was destroyed, but the image of his refusal survived. The system attempted to end a question by burning the questioner. Instead, it transformed him into a symbol. Fire did not end his thought, it broadcast it. To be burned alive is to be used as a lesson, but lessons do not always teach obedience. Sometimes they teach resistance. The same flames meant to enforce silence can illuminate injustice. This is the risk inherent in spectacle. Power must display itself to maintain control, but in doing so, it reveals its fear. A system that is confident in its truth does not need fire. It needs dialogue. Fire appears only when dialogue has failed and authority has nothing left to say. In the end, burning alive is not about death. Death is the smallest part of it. Burning is about fear, memory, and control. It is about telling the living where the boundaries lie. Bruno crossed those boundaries not with violence, but with thought, and fire was used to draw the line where words could not. This video is not about Bruno Giordano. Bruno is only the surface of this story. He is the entry point, not the destination. This video is not about a man who lived centuries ago, nor about the specific doctrines he challenged, nor even about the institution that killed him. Those details matter, but they are not the core. The core is the pattern, the mechanism, the repeated behavior that appears whenever a question threatens certainty. Bruno matters because he reveals how the world reacts when thinking goes beyond permission. He shows what happens when a human being refuses to separate survival from honesty. But the danger he faced did not disappear with him. It changed its language, its tools, its rituals, but not its logic. This video is about how questions are treated when they become inconvenient. It is about how systems respond when explanation is no longer enough to maintain order. It is about how obedience is rewarded, how hesitation is punished, and how refusal becomes unforgivable. Bruno is remembered not because he was unique, but because he was clear. He did not shout. He did not beg. He did not hide his uncertainty behind safer words. He accepted the cost of thinking openly in a world that demanded closure. This video is about that cost, about the silent pressure that teaches people when to stop asking, about the internal negotiation everyone learns to make between curiosity and safety, about the moment when a question feels true but dangerous, and silence feels false but secure. Bruno's death did not end the fear of questions. It refined it. Today, people are rarely burned for asking. They are isolated, discredited, erased, or slowly pushed out of relevance. The fire has become quieter, but it still burns. This video is not asking you to admire a martyr. It is asking you to notice a reflex, to recognize how often comfort is protected at the expense of truth, to see how easily systems convince people that stability matters more than honesty. Bruno's story survives because it exposes something uncomfortable, that the greatest threat to power has never been violence, but clarity, and that clarity, once seen, cannot be unseen. Giordano Bruno is remembered not because of the specific doctrines he held, but because his life reveals a recurring logic that governs how human systems react to uncertainty. At its core, this story is about the conflict between structures that require closure and minds that refuse it. Societies function by reducing complexity. They turn chaos into order by fixing meanings, defining limits, and declaring certain explanations final. This process is not inherently evil. It is how collective life becomes possible. But the moment a system confuses stability with truth, it becomes hostile to anything that reopens questions it has already sealed. Bruno's ideas threatened not because they were fully proven or widely accepted, but because they undermined the psychological need for a center. A centered universe supports centered authority. When the cosmos is finite and ordered, power can claim alignment with that order. When the cosmos becomes infinite, meaning becomes dispersed, and authority loses its metaphysical anchor. The logic is simple and ruthless. If there is no absolute center in reality, then there can be no unquestionable center in human affairs either. Systems cannot tolerate this implication because their legitimacy depends on appearing necessary, natural, and final. Bruno did not attack the system from outside. He exposed a flaw from within. He revealed that certainty was not divine, but constructed. Once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. That is why his trial was not about evidence, correction, or dialogue. It was about restoring the boundary that his thinking had crossed. His refusal to recant mattered more than the content of his beliefs, because recantation would have reaffirmed the system's authority over thought. Without that reaffirmation, punishment became inevitable. Burning was chosen not as justice, but as pedagogy. It was meant to teach observers where questioning ends and obedience begins. This logic repeats across history with different tools and languages. When questions become inconvenient, systems rarely answer them honestly. They label them dangerous, immature, immoral, or irresponsible. They isolate the questioner, drain their credibility, and turn doubt into a personal defect. Over time, people internalize these boundaries. They learn when to stop thinking, not because they are convinced, but because thinking becomes costly. The brilliance and tragedy of Bruno's story is that it makes this mechanism visible. He shows that the greatest threat to power is not rebellion, but clarity, not violence, but coherence, not denial, but refusal to pretend. His death was meant to close a question. Instead, it preserved it. And that is the deeper logic. Systems can destroy bodies, reputations, and voices, but they cannot permanently eliminate the questions that expose their dependence on fear. Bruno matters because he illustrates that truth does not become dangerous when it is false, but when it cannot be controlled. Giordano Bruno is remembered not because of the specific doctrines he held, but because his life reveals a recurring logic that governs how human systems react to uncertainty. At its core, this story is about the conflict between structures that require closure and minds that refuse it. Societies function by reducing complexity. They turn chaos into order by fixing meanings, defining limits, and declaring certain explanations final. This process is not inherently evil. It is how collective life becomes possible. But the moment a system confuses stability with truth, it becomes hostile to anything that reopens questions it has already sealed. Bruno's ideas threatened not because they were fully proven or widely accepted, but because they undermined the psychological need for a center. A centered universe supports centered authority. When the cosmos is finite and ordered, power can claim alignment with that order. When the cosmos becomes infinite, meaning becomes dispersed, and authority loses its metaphysical anchor. The logic is simple and ruthless. If there is no absolute center in reality, then there can be no unquestionable center in human affairs either. Systems cannot tolerate this implication because their legitimacy depends on appearing necessary, natural, and final. Bruno did not attack the system from outside. He exposed a flaw from within. He revealed that certainty was not divine, but constructed. Once this is seen, it cannot be unseen. That is why his trial was not about evidence, correction, or dialogue. It was about restoring the boundary that his thinking had crossed. His refusal to recant mattered more than the content of his beliefs, because recantation would have reaffirmed the system's authority over thought. Without that reaffirmation, punishment became inevitable. Burning was chosen not as justice, but as pedagogy. It was meant to teach observers where questioning ends and obedience begins. This logic repeats across history with different tools and languages. When questions become inconvenient, systems rarely answer them honestly. They label them dangerous, immature, immoral, or irresponsible. They isolate the questioner, drain their credibility, and turn doubt into a personal defect. Over time, people internalize these boundaries. They learn when to stop thinking, not because they are convinced, but because thinking becomes costly. The brilliance and tragedy of Bruno's story is that it makes this mechanism visible. He shows that the greatest threat to power is not rebellion, but clarity, not violence, but coherence, not denial, but refusal to pretend. His death was meant to close a question. Instead, it preserved it. And that is the deeper logic. Systems can destroy bodies, reputations, and voices, but they cannot permanently eliminate the questions that expose their dependence on fear. Bruno matters because he illustrates that truth does not become dangerous when it is false, but when it cannot be controlled. The purpose of this video is not to convince you of a conclusion, but to invite you into a question that has followed humanity across centuries. How do you personally react when a question unsettles what you already believe? Do you feel curiosity or discomfort? Do you lean closer or instinctively step back? When certainty is threatened, do you search for understanding or for protection? Every society teaches its members quietly and repeatedly which questions are safe and which ones carry a cost. At what point did you learn this lesson yourself? Was it in school, at work, in family, in faith, or in silence? When did you first realize that asking certain questions did not bring clarity, but consequences? And how often since then have you chosen not to ask? Not because you lacked curiosity, but because you understood the price of curiosity too well. Think about the systems you live inside today. Which ideas are open to debate, and which ones are treated as settled beyond discussion? Who decides that line? Is it written anywhere, or is it simply felt? When someone challenges a foundational belief, do you evaluate the argument, or do you first evaluate the person? Do you listen for truth or for threat? And when disagreement appears, do you experience it as an opportunity to understand, or as a danger to stability? Consider how often comfort is mistaken for correctness. How often agreement feels like truth simply because it feels safe. How often silence is interpreted as wisdom rather than fear. If a system you rely on were wrong about something fundamental, would you want to know? And if knowing meant losing belonging, status, or security, would you still choose to know? These are not abstract questions. They shape everyday behavior. They determine which ideas survive and which ones disappear without being openly rejected. They determine why some voices are amplified while others are quietly erased. History shows that most people do not actively oppose truth. They simply avoid it when it becomes inconvenient. So the real question is not whether you admire those who asked dangerous questions in the past. The real question is whether you recognize the moment when you stop yourself from asking one now. Giordano Bruno adds one more crucial layer to this entire logic that is often missed. He was not only punished for what he thought, but for how completely he accepted the consequences of thinking. Bruno understood something that many before and after him tried to avoid. That systems do not negotiate with ideas, they negotiate with fear. The moment fear disappears, authority loses its leverage. This is why Bruno's case dragged on for years. The institution was not searching for clarification. It was waiting for fatigue. It was waiting for the moment when survival would outweigh coherence. What made Bruno unbearable was not defiance, but calm consistency. He did not oscillate between belief and doubt in public. He did not ask for mercy. He did not attempt to translate his ideas into safer language. He refused to fragment himself. For Bruno, to think was not an activity separate from life. It was life. This meant that compromise would not merely save him, it would erase him. That is the deepest threat any system can face, a person for whom truth is not a position, but an identity. Bruno also exposes another uncomfortable truth, that persecution does not begin with violence. It begins with tolerance. He was debated, hosted, invited, protected, as long as his ideas could be admired as intellectual curiosities. The danger emerged only when those ideas stopped being ornamental and started becoming structural. Once thinking begins to reorganize how people see authority, hierarchy, and meaning, tolerance ends. Bruno crossed that invisible line when infinity stopped being poetry and became implication. Infinity implied that no institution could claim total knowledge. It implied that obedience was psychological, not cosmic. It implied that meaning could expand without permission. At that point, he was no longer a philosopher. He was a destabilizing presence. His execution was not the failure of justice. It was the success of logic as power understands it. The system removed the example before it could multiply. But this logic also carries its own contradiction. By killing Bruno, the institution confirmed the very fear it tried to deny, that questions, once articulated clearly, cannot be fully contained. Bruno's death did not end inquiry. It refined it. It taught future thinkers how power reacts, where pressure appears, and what the true cost of honesty can be. This is why Bruno matters beyond martyrdom. He reveals that the real boundary is not between truth and falsehood, but between managed thought and unmanaged thought. And history shows again and again that unmanaged thought is always treated as a threat, not because it is violent, but because it is free. Giordano Bruno was dangerous not simply because of what he believed, but because of what he demonstrated. Systems can tolerate ideas for a long time, especially when those ideas remain abstract, technical, or isolated. Ideas can be debated, reframed, delayed, or quietly ignored. A living example cannot. Bruno was not merely a thinker who held controversial views. He was a visible proof that a human being could think freely, speak openly, and remain internally consistent without collapsing into fear. That is the point where tolerance ends. Systems do not primarily punish thoughts. They punish precedents. An idea can be dismissed as theory. A person who lives according to that idea turns it into possibility. And possibility is far more threatening than disagreement. Bruno showed that one could refuse internal compromise. He showed that survival was not the highest value. He showed that authority over meaning was not inevitable. This made him contagious, not because others would immediately agree with him, but because others would realize that refusal was an option. Systems are built on the assumption that most people will adapt, bend, and eventually submit. When someone does not, that assumption begins to crack. The danger of Bruno was not mass conversion, it was psychological permission. If one man can refuse to separate truth from life, then obedience is revealed as a choice, not a necessity. That realization cannot be controlled once it appears. This is why systems historically move faster against examples than against theories. A book can be banned quietly, a lecture can be censored, a concept can be declared heretical. but a person who embodies a way of being must be removed publicly. The punishment is not aimed at the individual alone. It is aimed at anyone watching. The message is simple and brutal. Do not become this. Bruno's execution was not meant to erase his ideas from history. It was meant to prevent his posture from spreading. Systems fear posture more than content. They fear the calm refusal, the lack of desperation, the absence of bargaining. Bruno did not rage. He did not beg. He did not perform regret. He remained coherent. That coherence exposed the fragility of power. Authority relies on the belief that resistance will eventually fracture under pressure. When it does not, authority has only one tool left: spectacle. This is why systems often appear more violent toward individuals than toward movements. Movements can be negotiated with. Individuals who stand as examples cannot. They must be turned into warnings. In this sense, Bruno was not executed because he was wrong. He was executed because he was complete. He aligned thought, speech, and identity into a single, unmanageable form. And history shows that systems can forgive error, retreat, even heresy, but they cannot forgive an example that makes fear unnecessary. If Bruno was right, then the question is no longer about history, theology, or science, but about us. If he was right, then truth was never defeated by ignorance, but by comfort. If he was right, then silence was not forced upon people only by fire and prisons, but accepted willingly in exchange for safety, belonging, and stability. If Bruno was right, then the real punishment did not end in the public square where he burned. It continued quietly inside those who watched, learned the lesson, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. And if that logic still holds, then the most disturbing possibility is not that power still suppresses truth, but that it no longer needs to, because people have learned to suppress themselves. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Bruno was right, why do we still choose silence when asking would cost us little more than comfort? Why do we still hesitate, soften our words, postpone our doubts, and wait for safer moments that never arrive? Why does belonging still feel more valuable than honesty? Why does stability still feel more important than clarity? And if no fire is required anymore, if no trial is held, if no executioner stands before us, what exactly are we afraid of losing? Truth almost always falls on the shoulders of the individual because systems are designed to disperse responsibility while concentrating authority. A collective can act, decide, punish, and benefit, but it rarely feels accountable in the way a single person does. When truth threatens stability, the group instinctively looks for a place to deposit the cost, and the safest place is a lone human being. An individual can be isolated, named, blamed, corrected, or destroyed. A system cannot. This is not an accident of history, but a structural necessity. Truth demands clarity, and clarity demands a face. But power prefers anonymity. When responsibility is shared, guilt dissolves. When guilt dissolves, order survives. That is why truth is personalized while error is collectivized. When something goes wrong, it is always someone's fault. When something is maintained through silence, it is how things are. The individual becomes the bearer of tension that the group refuses to carry. This is especially true when truth exposes contradiction. Contradiction is unbearable for collectives because it threatens cohesion. Groups survive by agreement, not accuracy. The moment accuracy endangers agreement, accuracy becomes a liability. At that point, the person who insists on truth is no longer seen as honest, but as disruptive. The burden shifts from the idea to the person. The question is no longer, is this true, but why is this person causing trouble? In this way, truth is transformed from a shared responsibility into a personal defect. History repeats this pattern endlessly. Societies celebrate truth in the abstract, but punish it in practice. They praise courage after danger has passed, but demand silence while danger is present. This creates a moral outsourcing. People tell themselves that truth exists, that it matters, that someone else will speak, that institutions will correct themselves eventually. In the meantime, the cost is deferred onto individuals who refuse to wait. These individuals carry not only their own doubt, but the unspoken doubt of many others. They become vessels for collective anxiety. When they speak, they articulate what others feel but cannot afford to say. That is why their punishment feels strangely satisfying to the group. It relieves tension. It restores the illusion that the problem was not the structure, but the person. The individual is sacrificed to preserve the fiction of harmony. This mechanism also explains why truth is so often framed as heroism. Heroism sounds noble, but it hides cruelty. If truth requires heroes, then the system itself has failed. A healthy society would distribute the weight of honesty across many shoulders. Instead, it isolates it. It waits for someone exceptional to carry what should be common. And when that person breaks, the group mourns them safely after the threat has disappeared. This is why truth feels heavy, not because it is complex, but because it is lonely. It asks the individual to stand where the collective will not. It demands coherence in a world that rewards adaptation, and it reveals an uncomfortable reality that most people do not reject truth because they hate it, but because they do not want to be the one who carries it. If Giordano Bruno were alive today, he would not look like a heretic in chains or a man standing before a fire. He would look ordinary, and that is precisely what would make him dangerous. He would not announce himself as a revolutionary. He would not wear the costume of dissent. He would likely be educated, articulate, and intellectually restless, moving between disciplines rather than belonging comfortably to one. He would ask questions that sound reasonable on the surface, but quietly undermine assumptions people rely on to feel stable. He would not attack beliefs head-on. He would widen them until they lost their rigidity. In modern institutions, this kind of person is rarely met with flames. Instead, they are met with distance. Bruno today would be tolerated at first. His ideas would be labeled interesting, provocative, or thought-provoking. He would be invited to speak as long as his questions could be framed as intellectual exercises rather than implications. But the moment his thinking began to challenge structural authority rather than abstract theory, tolerance would thin. He would be told that his work is too broad, too speculative, too philosophical. He would be advised to narrow his focus, to choose a lane, to make his ideas more practical. These would sound like professional suggestions, but they would function as boundaries. If he refused to adapt, consequences would follow quietly. Bruno today would not be imprisoned. He would be excluded. His funding would disappear. His credibility would be questioned. He would be labeled unprofessional, unstable, or irresponsible. His ideas would be discussed without him. Algorithms would quietly reduce his visibility. Institutions would stop returning emails. Colleagues would distance themselves not because they disagree, but because proximity would feel risky. Social pressure would do what fire once did. He would not be executed for being wrong, but for being difficult to manage. And yet, the core of his danger would remain the same. He would refuse to separate thinking from living. He would not treat truth as a career strategy or a brand. He would not perform certainty to maintain belonging. He would continue to ask questions that do not resolve neatly. He would insist that knowledge is not owned by institutions and that meaning cannot be sealed. This posture would still feel intolerable because systems today, like those of the past, depend on predictability. They reward compliance framed as reasonableness. They punish independence framed as impracticality. Bruno today would likely be told that he is free to think whatever he wants, as long as he does not expect consequences to be shared. Freedom would be offered privately, while conformity would be enforced publicly. His struggle would not be dramatic, it would be slow, exhausting, and isolating, but the lesson would be identical. The danger is not that such a person might be wrong. The danger is that they make refusal visible. And once refusal is visible, silence becomes a choice rather than a default. Giordano Bruno. The moment we stopped asking questions is rarely dramatic. There is no fire, no courtroom, no public sentence. It happens quietly, almost politely, in a moment that feels practical rather than moral. Everyone has their own Bruno moment, though it never looks heroic at the time. It is the instant when a question forms clearly in the mind and is then gently pushed aside, not because it is untrue, but because it feels inconvenient. This is the moment we say, not now. Not now because the timing is bad. Not now because people would misunderstand. Not now because it would complicate things. Not now because there is something to lose. That phrase sounds harmless, but it carries weight. Not now is not neutrality. It is a decision. It is the point where truth is postponed in favor of continuity. Over time, postponement becomes habit, and habit becomes identity. The question is not silenced by force. It is softened by delay, and delayed long enough, it no longer feels urgent. This is how silence becomes reasonable. The quiet decision to step away from a question rarely feels like betrayal. It feels like maturity, responsibility, realism. We tell ourselves that understanding the world also means understanding its limits, that some questions are too big, too risky, too destabilizing. But beneath that reasoning is a deeper calculation. We sense, often correctly, that asking would change how we are seen. It might cost belonging, stability, or progress. And so we negotiate with ourselves. We keep the question private. We promise to return to it later. We convince ourselves that someone else will ask it more safely, more effectively, at a better time. This is the silent moment where truth is transferred from a shared responsibility to a personal burden we refuse to carry. The most unsettling part is that nothing external needs to enforce this decision. No authority has to intervene. No rule needs to be stated. The boundary is internalized. We learn where not to go by watching what happens to those who do. We learn that asking is not forbidden, but expensive. And expense changes behavior more reliably than punishment. Over time, the memory of the question fades, but the shape it left behind remains. A subtle narrowing of thought, a carefulness with words, a preference for safe conclusions over honest uncertainty. Giordano Bruno shows us that the moment we stop asking questions is almost never dramatic. There is no fire, no courtroom, no crowd gathered to witness a decision. Nothing visibly ends. Nothing officially begins. That is precisely why it is so powerful. Bruno's death looks dramatic to us because history compresses events into symbols. But the real mechanism that killed him did not start with flames. It started much earlier, in thousands of quiet moments where others chose not to follow their own questions. Bruno did not become dangerous when he was arrested. He became dangerous when he refused to participate in this quiet withdrawal. Most people imagine oppression as something external, imposed suddenly and violently. Bruno reveals a darker truth. Oppression is usually rehearsed internally long before it is enforced publicly. By the time a system burns someone, it has already taught everyone else how not to need fire. Bruno's world did not collapse because people stopped thinking altogether. It collapsed because they learned when to stop thinking. They learned which questions were safe curiosities and which ones threatened stability. They learned how to phrase doubt as speculation rather than challenge. They learned how to admire bold thinkers at a distance while never standing beside them. Bruno broke this pattern. He did not accept the unspoken rule that curiosity must retreat when it becomes inconvenient. He did not perform intellectual flexibility to preserve safety. He did not translate his thoughts into language designed to reassure power. This refusal made his questioning visible, and visibility is what systems cannot tolerate. What makes Bruno especially unsettling is that he forces us to recognize how rarely coercion is needed. No one forced most people to be silent. They watched, they adjusted, they learned. They understood that asking certain questions did not bring dialogue, but risk. So they told themselves that waiting was wise, that timing mattered, that survival was not cowardice. Each individual decision seemed small and reasonable, but collectively these decisions created an environment where someone like Bruno could be isolated without resistance. By the time the fire appeared, silence had already done most of the work. Bruno's story exposes the illusion that we stop asking questions because we are defeated. In reality, we stop because we adapt. We internalize the boundaries of acceptability until they feel like our own judgment. The most effective control is not censorship, but anticipation. When people begin to censor themselves, power no longer needs to intervene. Bruno refused this internal negotiation. He did not say, "Not now." He did not say, "Later." He did not say, "In private." He asked openly, continuously, and without apology. That is why his fate appears extreme. It is not that his world was uniquely cruel. It is that he refused to participate in its quiet compromises. Seen this way, Bruno is not a warning about the past. He is a mirror. He shows that the most decisive moment is not when punishment arrives, but when it becomes unnecessary. When people learn to stop themselves before being stopped. When questions fade, not because they are answered, but because they are deferred indefinitely. Bruno crossed the line where deferral ends, and that is why history remembers him not as a man who asked questions, but as a man who would not stop. Giordano Bruno does not need to be defended anymore. History has already placed him safely on the correct side. His name is taught, referenced, and quietly respected. But this respect comes with a distance that protects us. It allows us to believe that his fate belonged to another era, another mindset, another kind of cruelty. And that belief is comforting, because if Bruno belonged only to the past, then his story would carry no responsibility for the present. But Bruno does not disturb us because he was burned. He disturbs us because his logic never disappeared. He shows us that the most decisive battles over truth are not fought in public squares, but inside ordinary people making ordinary choices. He reveals that history does not collapse when violence appears, but when silence becomes reasonable. Bruno's life forces an uncomfortable realization. Systems rarely need to crush truth directly. They only need to make truth expensive. Once the cost is clear, most people adjust themselves willingly. They become careful, they become practical, they become realistic. They do not stop believing entirely, they simply stop insisting. Over time, this self-adjustment feels like maturity, like wisdom, like understanding how the world works. But what is really happening is quieter and more dangerous. The boundary of acceptable thought is being internalized. No one needs to say, "You cannot ask this." People learn to feel it. And once a boundary is felt rather than enforced, it becomes invisible. Bruno refused this invisibility. He did not treat truth as something that could be stored privately, while obedience was performed publicly. He did not split himself into a thinker and a survivor. For him, thinking was not a hobby. It was a condition of being alive. That is why compromise was impossible. Not because he was stubborn, but because compromise would have meant living a divided life. History often praises flexibility, but Bruno exposes its darker side. Flexibility can become self-erasure. Adaptation can become consent. Survival can become agreement with a lie. What makes Bruno especially relevant is that he does not ask us to imagine extreme courage. He asks us to examine small decisions, the moments when we say, "Not now," the moments when we soften a thought so it does not disturb, the moments when we recognize a contradiction and decide it is safer not to name it. These moments do not feel heroic or cowardly, they feel practical, and that is why they are powerful. They accumulate, they shape culture, they determine which questions survive and which ones fade without ever being openly rejected. History likes to tell us that truth always wins, but Bruno shows a more precise pattern. Truth often survives, but only after it stops being dangerous. Only after the people who carried it are gone. Only after the cost has been paid by someone else. This allows societies to admire truth without changing themselves. They honor thinkers once their thinking no longer threatens existing arrangements. In this way, memory becomes a substitute for responsibility. So this video does not end with an answer. Ending with an answer would repeat the very logic Bruno challenged. It ends with awareness, with attention, with the recognition that the most important moment is not when truth is punished, but when it is quietly postponed. Not when questions are forbidden, but when they are delayed indefinitely. Bruno's story remains unsettling because it asks something simple and heavy at the same time. If no one is stopping us, why do we stop ourselves? And if the fire is gone, what exactly are we waiting for? If you want to continue exploring questions like these, questions that history tried to close but never truly resolved, then stay with this channel. Subscribe not as an act of agreement, but as an act of attention. This space is for thinking slowly, for examining patterns that repeat across centuries, and for sitting with discomfort rather than escaping it. Thank you for staying until the end. The story does not conclude here. It continues wherever a question is allowed to remain open. Giordano Bruno is often remembered as a symbol of intellectual courage, but symbols can be misleading. They flatten complexity. They turn lived tension into clean narratives. Bruno's life was not a straight line toward martyrdom. It was uncertain, restless, often uncomfortable. He argued, wandered, contradicted expectations, and refused to settle into roles that made others feel secure. That refusal, more than any single idea, placed him outside protection. Systems are not built to accommodate restless minds. They are built to stabilize behavior. When a person refuses to stabilize, they expose how fragile stability really is. What Bruno reveals is not that truth is rare, but that persistence is. Many people glimpse uncomfortable truths. Few are willing to remain with them when pressure begins. Pressure does not arrive loudly. It arrives as suggestion, advice, concern, and warning. It asks you to be reasonable, to compromise, to wait. It tells you that survival is wisdom and that adaptation is maturity. Over time, these messages reshape identity. People do not feel silenced, they feel sensible. Bruno did not reject this pressure aggressively. He simply did not accept its terms. He did not convert uncertainty into obedience. He did not trade coherence for protection. That choice made him unclassifiable. History tends to explain his execution through ideology or doctrine, but those explanations are incomplete. The deeper reason lies in predictability. Power can manage opposition when it follows known patterns. It cannot manage a person who does not negotiate their inner position. Bruno did not present demands. He did not organize followers. He did not offer reform. He lived as if permission was irrelevant. That posture alone destabilizes systems that rely on internal compliance more than external force. Bruno's relevance today does not come from imagining ourselves in his place, facing flames. It comes from recognizing how rarely such extremes are needed. Modern systems are efficient. They do not burn people. They filter them. They marginalize without spectacle. They reward those who adapt and quietly remove those who do not. The result is the same: Ideas survive only when they stop disturbing. This is why Bruno cannot be comfortably celebrated. To celebrate him honestly would require questioning the conditions that made him unacceptable. It would require asking whether clarity is still treated as inconvenience, whether independence still carries cost, and whether truth is still expected to wait its turn. His story does not ask for admiration. It asks for awareness of how easily thinking becomes conditional. So this ending does not invite agreement or action. It invites attention. Attention to the small moments where thought is narrowed without command. Attention to how often certainty is valued over honesty. Attention to how easily freedom is redefined as permission. If Bruno teaches anything, it is that the most dangerous boundary is not the one enforced by punishment, but the one that becomes invisible. And once a boundary is invisible, crossing it feels unreasonable rather than forbidden. If this kind of reflection matters to you, if you are more interested in patterns than answers, in mechanisms rather than conclusions, then remain here. Subscribe to the channel, not as a declaration, but as a continuation. This is a space for questions that do not settle quickly and for histories that refuse to stay in the past. The video ends here. The thinking does not. Punishment is most effective when it no longer looks like cruelty, but like necessity. Systems rarely survive by openly admitting that they punish to protect power. Instead, they reframe punishment as something unavoidable, rational, even moral. It is presented not as a choice, but as an obligation, not as violence, but as responsibility. This transformation is crucial. The moment punishment is seen as optional, it becomes questionable. The moment it is seen as necessary, it becomes unquestionable. History shows that almost every act of repression is preceded by a story explaining why there was no other option. The language is always similar. Order must be preserved. Stability must be protected. Chaos must be prevented. The individual being punished is no longer a person, but a risk. Once someone is labeled a risk, harm against them becomes prevention rather than cruelty. This logic removes moral weight from those who enforce punishment. Judges do not feel cruel if they believe they are maintaining order. Executioners do not feel violent if they believe they are fulfilling duty. Spectators do not feel complicit if they believe the outcome was inevitable. The idea of necessity dissolves responsibility. If something had to be done, then no one truly chose to do it. This is how systems cleanse themselves emotionally. They turn decisions into procedures. They turn harm into maintenance. They turn fear into policy. What makes this framing so powerful is that it often contains a partial truth. Societies do require rules. They do require boundaries. They do require consequences. But the danger lies in how quickly necessity expands. It moves from protecting people to protecting institutions, from preventing harm to preventing discomfort, from stopping violence to stopping questions. Once punishment is justified as necessary for stability, stability itself becomes sacred. Anything that threatens it, even peacefully, can be treated as an emergency, and emergencies suspend ethics. In these moments, punishment stops responding to actions and starts responding to implications. People are no longer punished for what they have done, but for what they might inspire, for what they represent, for what they make visible. This is when punishment becomes symbolic. It is no longer about correction. It is about reassurance. It reassures the obedient that the world still has boundaries. It reassures authority that control is intact. It reassures the silent majority that they were right to remain silent. The most unsettling aspect of punishment, framed as necessity, is how easily it recruits consent. People who would reject cruelty often accept necessity. They say, "It's unfortunate, but what can be done?" This phrase is the emotional endpoint of the logic. It signals surrender of judgment. It replaces moral evaluation with resignation. Once people reach this point, punishment no longer needs enthusiasm. Indifference is enough. This is why systems invest so heavily in narratives of inevitability. If punishment is inevitable, then resistance becomes irrational. Questioning becomes naive. Compassion becomes dangerous. And those who object are framed as irresponsible, because they are seen as threatening the fragile balance everyone depends on. In this way, punishment not only controls behavior, but shapes perception. It teaches people what is reasonable to feel. The tragedy is that when punishment is accepted as necessity, injustice can continue indefinitely without appearing unjust. Violence no longer shocks. Silence feels mature. Compliance feels ethical, and the system does not need to defend itself with truth. It only needs to repeat that it had no choice. Punishment becomes truly dangerous when it is no longer presented as a decision, but as a requirement. At that point, it stops being evaluated morally and starts being accepted mechanically. Systems rarely say, "We punish because we want to." They say, "We punish because we must." This shift is subtle, but it changes everything. A choice can be judged. A necessity cannot. Once punishment is framed as unavoidable, questioning it feels irrational, even irresponsible. The discussion moves away from ethics and toward logistics. Not, "Is this right?" but "What else could we do?" This is how moral responsibility is quietly removed from human hands and transferred to abstraction. The language of necessity always appears calm and reasonable. It avoids anger and hatred. It sounds mature. It speaks of order, stability, safety, and prevention. The punished individual is no longer described as a person with motives or complexity, but as a problem that must be managed. Words like threat, risk, contagion, disruption, or instability begin to replace names. This linguistic shift is essential. You cannot easily harm someone you still see as fully human, but you can neutralize a risk without guilt. Once punishment is described as maintenance, it feels technical rather than violent. Harm becomes a tool, not an act. This framing also protects those who carry out punishment. When punishment is necessary, no one feels personally responsible. Judges are following the law. Officials are enforcing policy. Observers are accepting reality. Each role is small, limited, and justified. Responsibility dissolves across the structure. No single person feels accountable, and therefore no one feels guilty. This diffusion is not a side effect. It is the design. Systems survive by ensuring that cruelty is never owned, only executed. What makes this logic especially powerful is that it often grows out of real fear. Fear of chaos, fear of instability, fear of collapse. These fears are not imaginary. Societies do need coordination. They do need limits. But necessity expands faster than danger. What begins as protection against harm gradually becomes protection against discomfort, then protection against dissent, then protection against uncertainty itself. At that stage, punishment is no longer responding to actions, but to implications. People are punished not for what they did, but for what they might inspire, represent, or encourage others to consider. This is the moment punishment turns symbolic. Its goal is no longer correction, but reassurance. It reassures the obedient that boundaries still exist. It reassures authority that control has not been lost. And most importantly, it reassures the silent majority that their silence was wise. When someone is punished as a necessity, it retroactively justifies everyone who did nothing. It says, "You were right not to question. Look how dangerous this was." The most unsettling aspect of punishment, framed as necessity, is how easily it recruits ordinary, well-meaning people. Many who would reject cruelty will accept inevitability. They do not cheer. They do not celebrate. They simply resigned themselves. It's unfortunate, they say, but there was no alternative. This sentence is the final product of the logic. It signals the surrender of judgment. Ethics is replaced by fatigue. Compassion is replaced by realism. Once people reach this point, punishment no longer needs enthusiasm. Indifference is sufficient. Over time, this logic reshapes perception itself. People stop asking whether punishment is justified and start asking whether it is efficient, whether it was done cleanly, whether it restored calm. Injustice becomes normalized not through belief, but through routine. Violence loses its emotional weight. Silence begins to feel like maturity. Compliance feels responsible. And questioning begins to feel childish, dangerous, or naive. This is why systems invest so heavily in narratives of inevitability. If punishment is inevitable, resistance becomes unreasonable. If there was no choice, then disagreement is pointless. And if disagreement is pointless, then thinking becomes optional. At that point, punishment has achieved its deepest function. It no longer controls behavior through fear alone. It controls perception by teaching people what is sensible to feel and what is foolish to question. The tragedy is that when punishment is accepted as necessity, injustice no longer needs to hide. It can continue indefinitely without appearing unjust. The system does not need to prove itself right. It only needs to repeat calmly and consistently that it had no choice. The Ottoman Empire did not disappear overnight. There was no single battle, no single mistake, no single moment when everything suddenly collapsed. That is the most dangerous illusion in history. We like to believe that empires fall dramatically because drama feels distant and safe. But the Ottoman Empire faded slowly, quietly, and logically. And that is exactly why its story matters. Because slow collapses are harder to recognize while they are happening. The Ottomans did not rise because they were the most brutal force of their time. They rose because they were adaptive, because they absorbed what worked and discarded what didn't, because they allowed difference when difference was useful, because they rewarded competence over origin, loyalty over blood, function over ideology. This flexibility made them powerful, but power has a hidden side effect. Over time, power begins to mistake stability for correctness. What once felt like strategy begins to feel like identity, and once strategy becomes identity, questioning it feels like betrayal. At its peak, the Ottoman system worked so well that it stopped doubting itself. And this is where the real story begins, because empires do not die when they are attacked. They die when they stop asking why they exist the way they do. When survival turns into routine, when routine turns into tradition, and tradition turns into something that must be defended, not examined. The Ottomans did not fail to see the world changing. They saw it. But seeing is not the same as adapting, and adaptation requires something far more dangerous than strength. It requires admitting that what made you successful yesterday may be what destroys you tomorrow. This video is not about blaming the past. It is about understanding a pattern that repeats everywhere power lasts too long. The Ottoman Empire survived for centuries because it questioned itself early. It declined because it eventually stopped. Curiosity gave way to control. Flexibility gave way to fear. Innovation slowly became threat. And questions, once the engine of expansion, began to feel like cracks in the foundation. If you are expecting a list of dates, sultans, and wars, this is not that video. This is a story about systems, about how they rise when they listen, and decline when they defend themselves too well, about how strength becomes rigidity, about how success teaches the wrong lessons if it lasts long enough. The Ottomans did not collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because they believed they were complete. And no system that believes it is complete survives reality for very long. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, that is not an accident, because this is not only an Ottoman story, it is the story of every institution, every empire, every organization, and every belief system that confuses endurance with wisdom. What follows is not a judgment, it is an anatomy. And once you see the anatomy, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. Why did the Ottoman Empire survive for so long, yet collapse in a way that feels strangely familiar? How did a small frontier state transform into a world power that lasted for centuries? And why did the very mechanisms that once made it resilient slowly turn into sources of weakness? Was its strength rooted in military dominance or in something far less visible? Flexibility, adaptation, and strategic tolerance. At what point did survival turn into certainty and certainty into complacency? When did a system built on learning begin to fear change? Why do empires that last the longest often struggle the most with transformation? Did the Ottomans fail to see the world changing, or did they see it clearly and choose stability over risk? When does protecting tradition become more important than preserving relevance? How does success teach the wrong lessons when it lasts too long? Why do systems that once rewarded competence eventually begin to reward obedience instead? When did curiosity give way to control and innovation begin to look like threat rather than opportunity? Was the empire defeated from the outside, or did it slowly turn inward, defending its identity rather than adapting its strategy? Why do reforms arrive only when decline is already advanced? Why does power wait until the last moment to change? Is collapse caused by weakness or by the refusal to question what once worked? And if the Ottomans followed this pattern, how many modern systems are repeating it right now without realizing it? Why did the Ottoman Empire survive for so long, yet collapse in a way that feels strangely familiar? How did a small frontier state transform into a world power that lasted for centuries? And why did the very mechanisms that once made it resilient slowly turn into sources of weakness? Was its strength rooted in military dominance or in something far less visible? Flexibility, adaptation, and strategic tolerance. At what point did survival turn into certainty and certainty into complacency? When did a system built on learning begin to fear change? Why do empires that last the longest often struggle the most with transformation? Did the Ottomans fail to see the world changing, or did they see it clearly and choose stability over risk? When does protecting tradition become more important than preserving relevance? How does success teach the wrong lessons when it lasts too long? Why do systems that once rewarded competence eventually begin to reward obedience instead? When did curiosity give way to control and innovation begin to look like threat rather than opportunity? Was the empire defeated from the outside, or did it slowly turn inward, defending its identity rather than adapting its strategy? Why do reforms arrive only when decline is already advanced? Why does power wait until the last moment to change? Is collapse caused by weakness or by the refusal to question what once worked? And if the Ottomans followed this pattern, how many modern systems are repeating it right now without realizing it? Ottoman Empire was not founded as an empire, but as a solution to uncertainty. Its creation strategy was shaped not by strength, but by vulnerability. As a small frontier power surrounded by stronger rivals, the early Ottomans could not rely on rigid ideology, inherited privilege, or fixed institutions. Survival required flexibility. Decisions had to work in practice, not just in theory. What mattered was usefulness, not origin, loyalty, not lineage, effectiveness, not tradition. This created a system where adaptation was not a virtue, but a necessity. The Ottomans absorbed what functioned and discarded what did not, regardless of where it came from. Local customs were preserved if they maintained order. Existing administrative structures were kept if they worked. Authority was layered rather than imposed absolutely. This reduced resistance and increased cooperation, allowing expansion without constant rebellion. Power was centralized at the top, but flexibility was distributed below. The military was strong but not autonomous. Religion was influential but not absolute, and administration was functional rather than hereditary. This balance prevented any single force from dominating the system. Advancement was increasingly tied to ability rather than birth, creating loyalty to the state rather than to bloodlines. People served because the system rewarded participation rationally. At this stage, questioning was not seen as a threat. Asking what worked, what failed, and what could be improved was part of governance itself. The founding logic of the Ottoman system was simple, but powerful: adapt or disappear. But embedded within this success was a fragile condition. Flexibility thrived only as long as insecurity remained. The moment survival turned into certainty, the need to adapt began to fade. And when adaptation slows, strategy hardens into tradition. That silent transition would later become the empire's greatest weakness. Ottoman Empire treated religious tolerance less as a moral principle and more as a calculated instrument of rule. From its earliest expansion, the empire governed territories that were too diverse to be unified through force alone. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and numerous sects lived side by side across vast regions, each with their own laws, customs, and internal authorities. Attempting to erase these differences would have required constant repression and endless rebellion. The Ottomans understood something many empires learned too late. Belief is far harder to control than behavior, so instead of attacking the inner world of their subjects, they focused on managing the outer one. Tolerance was not generosity, it was efficiency. By allowing religious communities to govern their own internal affairs, the state reduced administrative burden, lowered resistance, and transformed potential instability into predictable order. People were far more willing to accept imperial authority when their faith, rituals, and communal identity were left intact. This system worked because it separated spiritual life from political loyalty. The empire did not demand that subjects believe the same things. It demanded that they obey the same rules. Taxes, security, and public order mattered more than doctrine. Religious leaders became intermediaries rather than enemies. They helped regulate their own communities in exchange for autonomy. In this way, tolerance functioned as a form of indirect control. Power did not need to penetrate every household or conscience. It only needed to ensure that each group had something to lose if stability collapsed. Tolerance created stakeholders. Communities that were allowed to exist became invested in the continuation of the system that allowed them to exist. Crucially, this tolerance was never absolute. It was structured, conditional, and hierarchical. The state remained supreme. Autonomy existed within limits clearly defined by political interest. When religious difference supported order, it was protected. When it threatened central authority, it was restricted or suppressed. This reveals the true logic behind Ottoman tolerance. It was not rooted in the idea that all beliefs were equally valid, but in the calculation that coexistence was strategically superior to uniformity. Tolerance reduced the need for violence, but violence always remained an option when tolerance failed. As long as the empire was expanding and confident, this arrangement produced remarkable stability. Diversity strengthened the system because the system was secure enough to manage it. Difference did not feel threatening because power felt uncontested. But tolerance depends on confidence. The moment insecurity enters the center, difference begins to look like vulnerability. As the empire faced military setbacks, economic pressure, and external competition, The same diversity that once stabilized rule began to generate anxiety. Religious plurality, once a political asset, started to appear as fragmentation. Autonomy began to look like disloyalty. The logic quietly reversed. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually as tolerance lost its strategic appeal. When survival feels uncertain, systems stop managing difference and start fearing it. Uniformity begins to feel safer than complexity. Control feels more reliable than balance. The empire's earlier strength, its ability to rule without erasing identity, slowly became a perceived weakness. The same mechanism that had reduced rebellion now appeared to invite it. In response, tolerance narrowed, conditions tightened, suspicion grew. The deeper lesson is not about religion itself, but about power psychology. Tolerance is easiest when authority feels secure. It becomes fragile when authority feels threatened. The Ottoman case shows that tolerance, when used as a political tool, is always temporary. It lasts only as long as it serves stability. Once fear replaces confidence, even the most pragmatic tolerance can be reinterpreted as risk. What was once a sign of strength becomes, in the eyes of power, a liability. And when tolerance is withdrawn, the system does not simply become harsher. It becomes more rigid, less adaptive, and ultimately less capable of managing the complexity it once ruled so effectively. Ottoman Empire reached its golden age, not because it abandoned its founding flexibility, but because it perfected it into a stable system. This period was defined by balance rather than domination, by coordination rather than chaos. The central strategy of the Golden Age was not constant expansion, but controlled sustainability. Power was strong enough to enforce order, yet restrained enough to avoid suffocating the structures beneath it. The state understood that longevity required more than conquest. It required administration that worked, legitimacy that felt natural, and a system that could absorb complexity without breaking. During this phase, the empire mastered the art of ruling difference without dissolving unity. Authority flowed from the center, but it did not crush the periphery. Instead, it organized it. One of the most critical elements of the Golden Age strategy was the refinement of merit-based governance. Advancement increasingly depended on competence, loyalty, and usefulness rather than hereditary privilege. This did not create equality, but it created efficiency. The system rewarded those who served it well, regardless of origin, which produced a powerful incentive structure. Talent flowed toward the state because the state converted talent into status and security. This strengthened central authority without relying solely on fear. People did not obey only because they were forced to, but because the system offered rational rewards for participation. Another key pillar was the careful separation and balancing of power centers. The military, administration, religious authority, and court politics were all powerful, but none were allowed to dominate absolutely. The army was disciplined and effective, yet dependent on the state. Religious legitimacy supported authority, but did not fully dictate policy. Bureaucracy ensured continuity, but did not replace sovereignty. This internal balance prevented sudden collapse and reduced internal coups. The empire did not rely on a single pillar. If one weakened, others compensated. This redundancy was strategic resilience. The Golden Age also refined tolerance into administration. Religious and cultural diversity was no longer just allowed, it was organized. Communities were categorized, regulated, and integrated into the fiscal and legal structure of the state. This turned diversity into predictability. Predictability reduced rebellion. Rebellion reduced the cost of rule. The state did not need to be everywhere at once because local structures enforced order internally. This decentralized compliance was far more efficient than constant repression. Crucially, during this period, the system still allowed limited internal questioning. not open ideological rebellion, but functional critique. Reforms occurred before crisis, not after collapse. Adjustments were incremental rather than desperate. The empire still believed that improvement was possible without threatening its identity. That belief mattered. As long as a system believes it can change, it remains alive. But the Golden Age carried a hidden danger. Stability began to feel permanent. Balance began to feel natural rather than maintained. What had once been a strategy slowly hardened into tradition. Success reduced the perceived need for experimentation. Institutions that had been tools became symbols. Symbols demand protection. Protection resists change. The empire did not notice this shift immediately because everything still worked. Order remained. Authority remained. Power remained. And that is the most dangerous moment for any system. When nothing appears broken, curiosity feels unnecessary. The Golden Age strategy succeeded so well that it planted the seeds of strategic inertia. The system was no longer asking how to adapt faster than the world. It was beginning to ask how to preserve itself, exactly as it was. Ottoman Empire was strong because it was not rigid. In its most successful centuries, the empire did not attempt to force uniform behavior, belief, or identity across its territories. Instead, it managed difference rather than erasing it. This softness was not weakness, it was strategy. By avoiding excessive central pressure, the state reduced resistance and lowered the cost of rule. People were not constantly pushed into rebellion because they were not constantly cornered. Flexibility allowed the empire to expand without collapsing under its own weight. Laws adapted to context. Administration adjusted to local realities. Authority did not insist on absolute sameness, and this created stability that brute force alone could never achieve. The Ottoman system understood that rigidity produces predictable opposition. When power is hard, resistance hardens in response. By contrast, a system that bends absorbs pressure rather than shattering. This approach allowed the empire to govern vast and diverse regions with relatively limited resources. Instead of policing belief, it regulated behavior. Instead of demanding emotional loyalty, it demanded practical compliance. This distinction mattered. People can tolerate external rules far more easily than internal coercion. By leaving inner worlds largely untouched, the empire avoided constant psychological warfare with its own subjects. This non-rigidity also allowed rapid adaptation. When circumstances changed, policies could change without threatening the core of the system. Flexibility created learning. Learning created resilience. The empire borrowed administrative practices, military techniques, and fiscal systems from others without seeing imitation as weakness. This openness accelerated innovation. A rigid system defends its identity. A flexible system improves its function. The Ottomans prioritized function, but softness has a condition. It only works when confidence exists at the center. When the empire felt secure, it could afford tolerance, balance, and adaptation. When insecurity later entered the system, softness began to feel dangerous. Flexibility was reinterpreted as vulnerability. Difference was reinterpreted as threat. Control began to replace balance. The strength that once came from not being rigid slowly eroded as rigidity crept in. The lesson is not that softness is always strength, but that rigidity is rarely safety. The Ottoman Empire thrived because it did not confuse authority with uniformity. It governed complexity rather than eliminating it. And as long as it did so, it remained powerful. When it forgot this principle, strength turned into stagnation and flexibility gave way to fear. Ottoman Empire reached its turning point not at the moment of a single defeat, but at the moment when its relationship with change quietly shifted. This was not a collapse of power, but a change in attitude toward power. The empire was still vast, still feared, still administratively functional. What changed was how it interpreted uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty had been a signal to adapt. Now, uncertainty began to feel like a threat to identity. This is the most dangerous transition any long-lasting system can undergo. The Ottomans did not suddenly become incapable of reform. They became suspicious of it. Questions that once improved governance started to feel destabilizing. Innovation, once absorbed pragmatically, began to look like admission of weakness. The system slowly moved from asking what works to asking what must be protected. Control started replacing curiosity as the empire matured. Institutions that had once been tools became symbols. The military, the bureaucracy, religious authority, and court traditions hardened into fixed structures that demanded preservation rather than adjustment. Balance turned into inertia. What had been flexible coordination became defensive maintenance. This shift was subtle because it happened while the empire was still functioning. Stability masked decay. Success created the illusion that existing methods were inherently correct rather than historically contingent. When a system believes its success proves its righteousness, it stops learning. External pressures accelerated this internal shift. European states were changing rapidly, economically, militarily, technologically, but the deeper problem was not that the Ottomans failed to notice these changes. They noticed them clearly. The problem was psychological. Adapting now felt like surrender rather than strategy. Borrowing began to feel like imitation. Reform began to feel like betrayal of legacy. The empire increasingly defined itself by continuity rather than performance. Tradition became identity. Identity demands defense, and defense resists change. Internally, this turning point altered incentives. Advancement gradually leaned away from competence and toward conformity. Obedience became safer than initiative. Maintaining order mattered more than improving systems. The cost of failure rose, so risk-taking declined. Officials learned that it was better to preserve what existed than to propose something new. This created a culture of caution. Caution is not collapse, but it is the end of growth. The turning point, then, was not a date, but a mindset. The empire began to treat adaptation as exceptional rather than normal. Reform was postponed, narrowed, or introduced only under crisis conditions. By the time change was accepted, it was already late. This is how decline begins while power still appears intact. The Ottomans did not lose because they were conquered too quickly. They lost because they learned too slowly. And once learning slows, even the strongest systems begin to fall behind reality, not suddenly, but inevitably. A system is strong when it does not need to constantly defend itself. Strength appears when authority is confident enough to tolerate uncertainty, difference, and internal friction. A strong system does not panic when questioned, because it understands that questioning is part of maintenance, not rebellion. It allows experimentation because failure does not feel existential. It listens because it does not fear being exposed. In such a phase, power is quiet. It does not shout its legitimacy. It does not demand constant loyalty rituals. It proves itself through function. People cooperate not because they are afraid, but because participation makes sense. Strength, in this sense, is not rigidity. It is elasticity. It is the ability to bend without breaking, to adjust without collapsing, to change without losing coherence. A system begins to fear its own power when survival turns into identity, when continuity becomes more important than effectiveness, when preserving the image of strength matters more than remaining strong. This is the moment power stops asking, "Does this still work?" and starts asking, "What happens if this changes?" Fear enters quietly. It does not announce itself as weakness. It announces itself as responsibility, tradition, stability, and caution. Questioning begins to feel risky. Innovation begins to feel disruptive. Adaptation is reframed as loss rather than strategy. The system starts protecting itself not from enemies but from uncertainty. At this stage, power becomes loud. It explains itself constantly. It demands reassurance. It equates obedience with loyalty and loyalty with morality. What once functioned through trust begins to rely on enforcement. The system does not collapse immediately. In fact, it may appear stronger than ever, but its relationship with reality has changed. It no longer adjusts to the world. It expects the world to adjust to it. And when the world does not, fear intensifies. A system fears its own power when it senses that its authority is no longer self-evident, when it must be repeated, performed, and defended, when symbols matter more than outcomes, when dissent feels like erosion rather than feedback. This fear produces rigidity. Rigidity reduces learning. Reduced learning widens the gap between the system and reality, and that gap is what eventually becomes decline. So the difference is not time, size, or force, it is attitude. A system is strong when it can afford to be questioned. It is afraid when it can no longer afford to listen. A system is strong when it does not need to constantly defend itself. Strength appears when authority is confident enough to tolerate uncertainty, difference, and internal friction. A strong system does not panic when questioned, because it understands that questioning is part of maintenance, not rebellion. It allows experimentation because failure does not feel existential. It listens because it does not fear being exposed. In such a phase, power is quiet. It does not shout its legitimacy. It does not demand constant loyalty rituals. It proves itself through function. People cooperate not because they are afraid, but because participation makes sense. Strength, in this sense, is not rigidity. It is elasticity. It is the ability to bend without breaking, to adjust without collapsing, to change without losing coherence. A system begins to fear its own power when survival turns into identity, when continuity becomes more important than effectiveness, when preserving the image of strength matters more than remaining strong. This is the moment power stops asking, "Does this still work?" and starts asking, "What happens if this changes?" Fear enters quietly. It does not announce itself as weakness. It announces itself as responsibility, tradition, stability, and caution. Questioning begins to feel risky. Innovation begins to feel disruptive. Adaptation is reframed as loss rather than strategy. The system starts protecting itself not from enemies but from uncertainty. At this stage, power becomes loud. It explains itself constantly. It demands reassurance. It equates obedience with loyalty and loyalty with morality. What once functioned through trust begins to rely on enforcement. The system does not collapse immediately. In fact, it may appear stronger than ever, but its relationship with reality has changed. It no longer adjusts to the world. It expects the world to adjust to it. And when the world does not, fear intensifies. A system fears its own power when it senses that its authority is no longer self-evident, when it must be repeated, performed, and defended, when symbols matter more than outcomes, when dissent feels like erosion rather than feedback. This fear produces rigidity. Rigidity reduces learning. Reduced learning widens the gap between the system and reality, and that gap is what eventually becomes decline. So the difference is not time, size, or force, it is attitude. A system is strong when it can afford to be questioned. It is afraid when it can no longer afford to listen. Ottoman Empire mastered one of the most effective governing formulas in history: strong central authority combined with local flexibility. This balance was not accidental, it was strategic. The center held ultimate power over taxation, military force, and legitimacy, but it did not attempt to micromanage every region in the same way. Instead of enforcing uniform administration across vastly different lands, the empire allowed local conditions to shape how authority was exercised. This meant that villages, cities, and provinces could retain familiar customs, legal practices, and social structures as long as they did not challenge the core authority of the state. Central power set the boundaries, but local systems filled in the details. This reduced friction. People were governed without feeling constantly invaded by an alien structure. The state felt present but not suffocating. This arrangement created efficiency. The center did not waste energy solving problems it did not fully understand, and local actors were incentivized to maintain order because they operated within systems they recognized. Loyalty flowed upward not because of ideological devotion, but because cooperation was practical. The empire could mobilize resources, raise armies, and enforce law when necessary, yet everyday life remained largely self-regulating. This reduced the cost of rule dramatically. Instead of constant coercion, governance relied on predictability. People knew where power ended and where autonomy began. Crucially, this balance also protected the system from sudden collapse. When pressure increased in one area, flexibility allowed adjustment without threatening the whole structure. Local unrest did not automatically become imperial crisis. Problems were absorbed, negotiated, or contained. The center remained strong because it did not need to be everywhere at once. Its authority was symbolic and decisive, not intrusive. This distinction matters. Power that intervenes everywhere eventually weakens itself. Power that intervenes selectively preserves its strength. However, this balance required confidence. Central authority had to trust that flexibility would not become fragmentation. As long as the empire felt secure, that trust existed. When insecurity later grew, the same local autonomy began to look suspicious. Flexibility was reinterpreted as loss of control. The center started tightening its grip, reducing elasticity and demanding uniformity. This shift broke the original formula. Central power expanded, but local cooperation shrank. What had once been balance turned into tension. The lesson is clear. Centralized power without local elasticity becomes brittle. Local autonomy without central authority becomes chaotic. The Ottoman system worked because it combined both. It failed when fear pushed the center to abandon trust in the very flexibility that had once made it strong. Ottoman Empire reached its most dangerous phase, not when it was militarily defeated, but when it began to believe its own story. Every long-lasting system eventually creates a narrative about itself. At first, this narrative is functional. It explains why certain rules exist, why authority is organized the way it is, and why loyalty makes sense. But over time, the story stops being a tool and becomes an identity. When that happens, reality is no longer evaluated independently. It is filtered through the story. Success is interpreted as proof of correctness. Survival is interpreted as validation. Longevity becomes evidence of truth. This is the moment when a system stops measuring itself against the world and starts measuring the world against itself. For the Ottoman Empire, this story was powerful. It was the story of divine order, historical destiny, inherited legitimacy, and proven endurance. Centuries of survival created the belief that the system was not just effective, but rightful. What had once been a strategy shaped by circumstances slowly transformed into a sacred inheritance that had to be protected. The empire no longer asked whether its structures still worked. It assumed they must because they had always worked. Change began to feel unnecessary, then disrespectful, then dangerous. The story provided comfort, but it also narrowed perception. When problems appeared, they were explained away as temporary deviations rather than signals of deeper mismatch. Believing its own story allowed the empire to reinterpret warning signs as exceptions. Military setbacks were blamed on individuals rather than structure. Economic strain was blamed on external forces rather than internal rigidity. Administrative inefficiency was treated as moral failure instead of systemic design flaw. The narrative absorbed contradiction instead of confronting it. This is how decline hides inside continuity. Nothing seems broken enough to demand change, because the story explains why everything is still fundamentally sound. Once a system believes its own story, loyalty becomes more important than accuracy. Officials learn that repeating the narrative is safer than questioning it. Advancement favors those who protect the image rather than those who challenge the function. Over time, the system becomes surrounded by affirmation instead of feedback. This is not because people suddenly become dishonest, but because honesty becomes costly. The story rewards agreement. Disagreement feels like disloyalty, and when identity is at stake, even useful criticism is experienced as attack. The most dangerous consequence of this self-belief is the loss of learning. A system that sees itself as historically justified stops seeing itself as improvable. Reform no longer feels like evolution. It feels like erasure. Borrowing from others feels humiliating. Admitting weakness feels existential. The empire begins to defend its narrative instead of adjusting its strategy. At that point, power still exists, but adaptability fades. And without adaptability, power becomes brittle. Imperial self-belief also reshapes time perception. The future is imagined as an extension of the past, rather than as an unknown environment requiring new tools. This creates strategic delay. Problems are acknowledged but postponed. Reforms are discussed but softened. Decisions are made cautiously, always with reference to precedent. The system waits for reality to slow down, but reality does not wait. By the time change is unavoidable, the cost has multiplied. The irony is that the story was once true. The Ottoman system really did succeed because of its balance, flexibility, and pragmatism, but believing that success made those qualities permanent was the mistake. A story that once described reality slowly replaced reality itself. And when that happens, decline does not arrive as catastrophe. It arrives as confusion. The empire still believes it is strong, but the world no longer responds as it once did. This is the quiet danger of any powerful narrative. It protects identity at the expense of awareness. It explains the past so well that it blinds the future. And when an empire begins to trust its story more than its signals, it does not fall suddenly. It drifts, confident, dignified, and increasingly out of sync with the world it once mastered. Ottoman Empire did not collapse because it was incapable of change. It collapsed because it learned to live inside its past. The living in the past syndrome does not mean nostalgia alone. It means using past success as a substitute for present evaluation. It means assuming that what once worked must still work, not because it fits reality, but because it fits identity. For the Ottomans, history became reassurance. Each previous survival delayed urgency. Each past victory softened warning signs. Instead of asking whether the system still matched the world, the empire asked whether the world was deviating from the empire. This reversal is subtle but fatal. When a system begins to treat its past as proof rather than reference, it stops updating itself. The past becomes a shelter instead of a lesson. Fear of change did not appear as panic. It appeared as caution, as responsibility, as respect for tradition. Reform was no longer rejected openly. It was postponed, diluted, and softened. Change was framed as risky not because it might fail, but because it might disturb balance. And balance, once stability replaces adaptability, becomes sacred. The empire did not refuse reform because it did not understand the need for it. It refused reform because reform threatened continuity. When continuity becomes the highest value, even improvement feels dangerous. This is why the Ottoman decline feels slow rather than dramatic. Nothing breaks suddenly. Institutions continue to function. Rituals continue. Authority continues. The system still looks alive, but its timing is wrong. Decisions arrive late. Adjustments lag behind reality. Responses are always reactive rather than anticipatory. The empire does not fall. It waits. It waits for conditions to improve, for pressure to ease, for the world to return to something familiar. This waiting is not passive. It is structured. It is justified. It feels intelligent. And that is what makes it deadly. Living in the past creates a distorted sense of time. Problems are acknowledged, but they are framed as temporary deviations rather than signals of structural mismatch. Each delay feels reasonable on its own. Together they form paralysis. The system becomes excellent at explaining why now is not the right moment. Not yet becomes policy. Soon becomes strategy. By the time change is unavoidable, it is no longer manageable. Reform turns into emergency, and emergency reform is always weaker than gradual adaptation. Fear of change also reshapes incentives. Those who protect tradition are rewarded. Those who challenge it are marginalized. Innovation becomes risky. Initiative becomes suspicious. Officials learn that survival depends not on improving the system, but on not disturbing it. Over time, this produces a culture of delay. People do not resist change loudly. They exhaust it quietly. They slow it down until it loses momentum. This is how decline hides inside patience. The most important distinction, then, is this. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because it failed. It fell because it was late. Late to adapt, late to reform, late to abandon structures that no longer fit the world they were designed for. It was not destroyed by a single enemy, but by accumulated delay. History often calls this collapse, but collapse suggests suddenness. What happened instead was postponement. The empire survived each crisis just long enough to miss the opportunity created by the next one. In this sense, the Ottoman story is not a tragedy of weakness, but of timing. The system remained powerful long enough to believe it still had time. And believing you still have time is often the most dangerous belief of all. Ottoman Empire expanded not because it followed a rigid ideological mission, but because it pursued advantage wherever advantage was possible. Its early growth was not driven by a fixed blueprint of what the world should look like, but by a practical assessment of what worked in each moment. This is a crucial distinction. Ideological expansion seeks to remake reality in its own image. Benefit-based expansion adapts to reality instead. The Ottomans did not ask conquered territories to immediately conform to a single cultural, legal, or religious identity. They asked a simpler question: can this territory be integrated in a way that increases stability, revenue, and control without excessive cost? If the answer was yes, expansion followed. If not, patience or negotiation replaced force. This made growth slower than pure conquest, but far more sustainable. Because expansion was pragmatic rather than doctrinal, the empire could absorb difference without treating it as contamination. Diversity was not seen as a threat to purity, because purity was never the objective. Function was. This is why religious tolerance became a political instrument rather than a moral commitment. Allowing different faiths to exist was not about equality in belief, but about efficiency in governance. Belief was left intact so behavior could be regulated. People were easier to rule when their inner world was not under constant assault. Tolerance lowered resistance, reduced rebellion, and stabilized newly integrated regions. It was cheaper than repression and more reliable than forced conversion. Religious communities were not simply allowed to exist. They were organized into manageable units. This transformed difference into structure. Each group governed its internal affairs while remaining subordinate to imperial authority. The state did not need to penetrate every conscience because it controlled the framework in which consciences operated. Tolerance functioned as indirect rule. It turned religious leaders into intermediaries and communities into stakeholders. As long as stability was maintained, belief was irrelevant. The empire demanded loyalty to order, not agreement in faith. This approach only works when expansion is benefit-driven rather than identity-driven. Because the Ottomans were not trying to prove moral superiority through uniformity, they could afford pluralism. Expansion increased strength because it increased capacity, not because it fulfilled ideology. Every new region added resources, manpower, and strategic depth without requiring total transformation. This is why early Ottoman expansion appears fluid and opportunistic, rather than linear and fanatical. Alliances shifted, methods changed, local elites were absorbed rather than erased. The empire grew by addition, not replacement. But this logic also had limits. Tolerance as a political tool depends on confidence. As long as the empire felt strong, diversity was manageable. As long as expansion continued, pluralism paid dividends. When expansion slowed and pressure increased, the same tolerance began to feel risky. Difference, once useful, started to look like fragmentation. Pragmatism slowly gave way to defensiveness. The benefit-based logic weakened and ideological thinking crept in to fill the void. The deeper lesson is that tolerance rooted in strategy is always conditional. It lasts as long as it produces advantage. Once fear replaces confidence, even the most pragmatic systems begin to seek uniformity. What began as flexible expansion hardens into identity defense. And when expansion is no longer guided by benefit, but by preservation of self-image, the system loses the very adaptability that once made it powerful.